As the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union dragged on, Hitler and his high command found themselves falling short of critical objectives. Operation Barbarossa was meant not only to seize Soviet territory, but more critically, to supply the Third Reich with desperately needed raw materials, namely oil. Germany was running out of fuel, even with their junior partner Romania pouring over 100,000 tons of oil barrels into Germany's collective tank as the Wehrmacht burned through their meager supplies. Hitler and High Command turned their gaze toward capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. The summer of 1942 would see the Nazis focus their efforts on the southern Soviet Union with the goal of capturing these oil fields, a plan better known as Fall Alito Blau, or Case Blue. However, Hitler would later add another objective, the capture of the city of Stalingrad, a logistical center named for his communist frenemy. The city of Stalingrad, formerly known as Tsaritsyn, was not originally part of Nazi plans for Case Blue. Though an important transport hub hosting a number of factories and steelworks, the initial drafts of Case Blue were focused entirely on securing the Caucasian oil fields. The Volga-hugging city of 500,000 inhabitants just didn't figure into German plans. With the failure of Operation Barbarossa still fresh in their minds and the front lines stagnating, the dawn of spring meant it was time for a new push into the Soviet Union. This push involved an Axis army of 1,300,000 men, 300,000 of whom were soldiers from Italy, Romania, Hungary, and Croatia, advancing towards Astrakhan before securing their northern flank along the Don and the Volga, then advancing south toward the Caucasus. The ever-erratic Hitler, however, decided this plan was far too simple and ordered Army Group South split in two so they could achieve both objectives simultaneously. The newly christened Group A would drive for the Caucasus Mountains in the south, while Group B would make for the Volga by way of the Don. Satisfied that he had complicated his generals' lives sufficiently, Hitler let the offensive begin on June 28th. The Soviets were taken completely by surprise and found the second verse of the Nazi invasion the same as the first. The Germans made rapid progress into Soviet territory, and by mid-July, the German Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus was within striking distance of Stalingrad. Hitler ordered Stalingrad to be taken on July 23rd. In addition to being a transport hub and possessing some manufacturing, Stalingrad served as an artery in the Lend-Lease system that saw Allied supplies shipped to the Soviets by way of Iran. But Hitler's Sixth Army was growing weaker with every instant. German supply lines were stretched so thin that in a grim omen of things to come, some Germans resorted to eating their horses. In addition, a full quarter of Paulus's casualties thus far had been due to typhus and dysentery, which dug their claws deep into both German and Soviet forces. Speaking of Soviets, Stalin had predicted Hitler's change of strategy and was making preparations. Factories turned out a tidal wave of tanks, and reserves were brought in to reinforce Stalingrad. On July 27th, Stalin issued the infamous Order 227, commanding all Soviet soldiers to take not a step back and laying down heavy penalties for officers who retreated without approval. After nearly a month of preparations on both sides, the Germans and their allies crossed the Don River on August 21st, setting the stage for one of the bloodiest fights in history. The Luftwaffe opened the assault on Stalingrad with a multi-day bombing, which reached its zenith on August 23rd. German spearheads drew close to the city not long thereafter, encountering fanatical resistance before driving to the Volga on the northern side and were promptly cut off by the Communists. A pocket formed around this spearhead, and troops under General Gustav Anton von Wietersheim were encircled. 2 days later, General Hermann Hoth led the 4th Panzer Army in an attack on the southern side of the city, only for the Russians to turn him back. A second armored spearhead managed to break through the northern pocket and drop off critical supplies, but the would-be rescuers abandoned the pocket when it became clear they did not bring sufficient infantry to hold their position. The Soviets to the south slowly lost men to the northern front line, with the final division remaining in the sector belonging to the secret police. As the civilian population broke into a panic, Hoth drove northward, ultimately covering 20 kilometers. The Soviet commander withdrew his men to better defensive positions within the city. August ended with Paulus's Sixth Army breaking into the northern encirclement, relieving their comrades after a week of dug-in fighting. As September began, the Nazis partially encircled Stalin's city. Georgy Zhukov, future hero of the Soviet Union, launched an attack in the north meant to break up the German line and once again encircle the fascists, but the Germans were able to hold fast. As the temperature in Stalingrad began dropping, icy winds dispatched from the Russians' old ally, General Winter, provided a fitting prelude to a storm gathering in the Russian camp. For almost the entire month of September, in utmost secrecy, Joseph Stalin, Georgy Zhukov, and the Russian High Command had been formulating plans for a counter-offensive, and they were almost ready to make their move. As the Soviet reinforcements continued to make their way into Stalingrad, Paulus launched an assault on the industrial sector. The reinforced Soviets pushed the Nazis back, and on October 4th, Paulus learned that the 51st Corps, long the tip of the Germanic spear, had taken such extensive casualties that it had lost all offensive capability. The Germans halted offensive operations for a full 10 days to rest and resupply, save for a push on October 13th by Hoth, which saw the Fourth Army finally reach the Volga. The rest of October was a hard slog for the Germans and Soviets, as the Germans renewed their assault on the industrial district and began to make headway. The Germans paid dearly for every moment they advanced. The bombing raids by the Luftwaffe that had opened the battle bore bitter fruit. The Soviets fortified or hid in hollowed-out buildings and mazes of rubble, making the corpse of the city into a near-continuous line of defenses and traps that forced the Germans to advance methodically. The German advance through the industrial zone continued through November, as the Soviets resisted them at every step. By the 11th, the Soviets were pushed into isolated pockets of resistance. The Germans, low on men, material, and willpower, began to stumble. A week later, the Soviets held only a stretch of the shoreline at the Volga, no more than 10% of the city. The Russians were on the ropes, but the Germans were too battered and undersupplied to press their assault. Paulus could count over 60,000 casualties in the Sixth Army alone. Both the Germans and besieged Russians licked their wounds and settled into rhythms of a stalemate, neither side aware of the earth-shattering events to come. As General Winter covered Stalingrad in a raging blizzard, Zhukov sprang his long-prepared trap. The Soviets launched their mammoth counteroffensive, appropriately dubbed Operation Uranus, on November 19th. 10 Soviet armies, totaling 1 million men, almost 1,000 tanks, and over 1,000 planes, washed over the Germans like a crimson tide. Over the course of 3 days, the Soviets succeeded in completely reversing the fortunes of the battle, tearing into the Axis lines to encircle 40,000 Romanian troops protecting the German southern flank, before driving their pincers into an almost total encirclement of the Fourth and Sixth Armies. Paulus was presented with a fateful decision: attempt a breakout, or dig in and wait for the metaphorical cavalry. High Command began entertaining the idea of resupplying the Sixth Army by air, an idea that would lay the foundation for the Sixth Army's destruction. The Luftwaffe began dropping critical stockpiles of ammunition and fuel, but no food. As the encirclement dragged on, the German army starved, and bread rations were slashed in desperation. As the snow piled up around him and the Luftwaffe finally began delivering desperately needed supplies of food, Paulus took stock of the Sixth Army. 34,000 of the 300,000 who marched on Stalingrad were still alive. On December 12th, von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to break through to Paulus and relieve the Germans trapped in Stalingrad. Paulus asked Hitler for permission to break out, and once again he was refused. The Sixth Army could only wait for liberty or destruction. After a week, von Manstein was bogged down by the Soviets a mere 29 miles from the city. New offensives waylaid von Manstein further, and the dutiful Paulus continued to follow his Führer's orders to stay put. The new year would only bring new misery for the Germans. Bands of soldiers roamed the ruined streets looking for food and warmth. Thousands of wounded languished untreated due to a lack of supplies. The Soviets offered the Germans a generous surrender, giving Paulus the chance to save his men and himself from certain death. The proud Prussian refused, and on January 6th, the Soviets launched a new wave of attacks that carved the Sixth Army into two pieces. On the 22nd, the Soviets again solicited a surrender, and Paulus sent a message to Hitler that his men had no ammunition nor food, and that his ability to command them was degrading by the moment. 2 days later, he reported that he had 18,000 wounded left completely untreated, and begged Hitler for permission to surrender. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold his position to the last man, the last cartridge. Not a day later, the Soviets captured the last remaining airfield that the Germans could use to receive airdrops. Whatever Paulus had in his stores was all he ever would. Throughout the encircled 6th and 4th, 100,000 men died in January alone, and the two armies had been split into northern and southern pockets with no way of communicating. As Paulus struggled with Hitler's order not to surrender, he received a most unwelcome surprise, a promotion to field marshal. But instead of an honor, it was a death sentence. With the stroke of his pen, Hitler ordered Paulus to place himself upon the altar of National Socialism and die. On January 31st, Paulus became the first German field marshal taken captive. On February 2nd, the Sixth Army formally surrendered to Georgy Zhukov. There was no fanatical resistance or desperate grab at victory. These were Germans fearful of Soviet reprisal. It would take until March of 1943 for the Soviets to root out these renegade Germans and fully secure Stalingrad. The civilian population of Stalingrad fared little better than the men in uniform. Though there were sporadic evacuations of civilians throughout the battle, the loss of life was still enormous. 170,000 civilians died in the Battle of Stalingrad. While the Soviet prisoners of war under German care had been almost annihilated, the Germans would fare no better. 95% of the men captured by the Soviets at the end of the battle wouldn't see home again. Stalingrad was a bloodbath, a churning engine of destruction fed by human life and misery. But it was also a testament to the fighting spirit of those on the ground as the Soviets clung by their very fingernails to the city and threw the Germans back. If you enjoyed this content, visit our channel for more stories like this. Please like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. Also let us know in the comments where you are watching from.